Adversarial play. In the past, I've done several episodes on adversarial refereeing. That is, the difference between putting challenges in front of your players and being vindictive against them, treating them like a competitor or treating them like an enemy. But I don't remember if I have done an episode on adversarial play, the same behavior from the other side of the table. So that's what I'm going to talk about today, and hopefully, if I have done an episode in the past, I'm consistent with what I forgot I said. Welcome back to the Whispering GM. So, how does one play adversarially? Well, there's two obvious directions. One, you can be adversary to the other players, or two, you can be adversarial to the ref. We'll start off with the second, because that's the most obvious. It's simply the opposite of the adversarial referee, isn't it? So, what might that look like? Could it be rules lawyering? Looking at the letter of the law in order to get more of an advantage from your character. I saw a meme, at least I think that these pass for memes these days, but there was no picture, just text, where one player said your attack would be at disadvantage. This is a 5th edition game, obviously, and the referee goes, well, why? Well, my character is invisible. Yes, I have Detect Invis running. Yes, you detect the Invis, but the wording of the spell does not say it negates the effects of the invisibility, only that you detect where the invisible thing is. Now, I don't play 5th edition, so I don't have the text on my hand, but I can tell you that if that came up at my table, there might be some reckoning. But the truth is, that hasn't come up at my table. The closest thing that I could think of is actually a 3rd edition game where we were creating characters. I think they started at 6th level. And one player came in with a character that was obviously overpowered. What had happened? He had picked a race out of one of the Splat books, and all of the books were allowed, provided our DM had access to them. He had picked a race out of a Splat book that specified it had a level adjustment of plus however many, but it did not specify that the hit dice also contributed to effective level. In every other level adjusted or hit dice adjusted race, that contributed to your effective level. But this book didn't say it, so he was within the letter of the law. The DM said that was unfair, didn't think that was the spirit of the rule, and if he wanted to play that race, he would need to come in at a higher level. We'd have to figure something out. The player accepted it. He played a different race, and we had a successful game that went on from there. In that sense, many will say rules lawyering may constitute, between friends, iron sharpening iron. How else do you learn to play a game? How else do you get better at a game? If not by playing by the rules, by accepting correction when correction occurs. So, not necessarily rules lawyering, but could be. Let's try again. So how then can we be an adversary against the ref as a player? Well, how about munchkinning? Again, I'll harken back to a 3rd edition experience. There's a lot of, munchkinning, bad player things coming out of 3rd edition. I wonder why. I'm winking. I know it's an audio podcast, but ocular asterisk. But back in a 3rd edition game, a player built a trip build. He played a fighter, he put his feet into the spiked chain and improved trip, and he spent all of his effort keeping characters, enemy characters, on the ground, so it would nullify most infantry attacks. It was boring, honestly, in those encounters, because all of them went the same way, provided they had 2 legs to stand on, or not. So arguably, that player was engaging with the meta in order to take advantage of encounters and to nullify the DM's effort. But if that's the case, that taking these feats and putting in these builds nullified the DM and constituted bad play, why were they included? If you weren't intended to play the trippy character, why were trippy weapons, tripping rules, and tripping specialties included? That player was nullified by centaurs, much harder to trip things with 4 legs, and also sturges. Can't trip something if they're not on the ground. So, was the build a trap or just a tool? There are a lot of things in that edition of the game that have very specific uses, and you do specific things with them. So in that case, it's not necessarily an attempt to derail the ref, but engaging with the game. A much more fun example of this, one that I enjoyed, possibly because a friend did it as opposed to a stranger. He became a friend. We're not unfriendly here at this local gaming shop. But a friend of mine built what he called the checkerboard wizard. He took essentially no damage spells. He took stuff like Grease, Gust of Wind, and other spells that would allow him to reposition other people on the field and move elements of the game around such that things benefited the party. Why did he do that? Well, it's too easy to fireball. That's no fun. You have to think. He wanted to think. And so he thought, and he made his character, he wrote his spellbook out in such a way as to be conducive to being productive in a unique way. Engaging with the meta, engaging with the words of the spell, and figuring out how different things would play off of each other. In the latter case, it was fun to watch it play out, because I learned some things that I didn't think of, and how they would interact with each other. But moreover, I think this concludes that trying to munchkin out doesn't necessarily equate to adversarial play. Let's try one more time. 2 for 0 so far. Let's see if we can go 1 for 3. How else might one play adversarially towards the ref? How about conspiracy and derailment? No more 3rd edition stories. This is an OSR podcast after all. Playing BX, I remember distinctly doing a module with a friend who was getting back into the game, and it was one of the Necrotic Gnome adventures. I forget the name of the module, but if for those of you who are more versed in Gavin Norman than I am, it's the one with the redacted human sacrifice. That is, I think the old editions have it and the new editions don't. So if that rings a bell, let me know. That's the module we were playing. We came up to this mound and we saw the human sacrifice occurring. And the tomb that we had come for, we had heard a rumor that there was treasure or something down in this barrow, was right there. And so what do? We follow the cultists. The 2 cultists who performed the human sacrifice are in the woods. They walk off into the wilderness, and we followed them. Then the referee gave us a hint. The bushes are getting thicker. There's an owl, and owls in your culture are indicative of bad juju. We just kept following. We eventually came to a lake's front where they turned into birds and flew. And then where had the time gone? We had to come back, and it wasn't until the second session that we actually went into the adventure. Later, I found out literally everything outside the boundary of the mound was improvised. Was our party, by coming to a session, hey guys, I'm running X module, was our party being an adversarial party by walking away from the adventure? Sure, we came back, but you have the same story in a lot of OSR games. A lot of OSR campaigns are run in a West Marches kind of style, where the referee tends to expect that the caller of the game is going to say, okay, this is what we're going to do. We're going to try to go after adventure X or location Y and do the whatever happens there. And what happens when the party shows up and they say they were going to go north, so you preps to go north, and then they turn south? In a convention setting, absolutely adversarial, 100%. I have 3 hours, I have 30 pages of adventure, and if you turn away from this adventure, then you walk away from the table, because that's what I'm here to run. It was on the sign-up sheet. But in a campaign, not necessarily. I'm thinking about some of the old Kalmata videos. I like to harken back to Jason, because if I talk about him enough, he calls in. One of the most memorable adventures that I remember watching on the elliptical was when the party went south instead of north. The party came across this sandbar. They uncovered what appeared to be the roof, the lid of Forgotten Sarcophagus. There were these big crab monster type things that came in, and they eventually got killed. And Thaddeus, one of the players, I believe, he had a near-death experience because Hobbs uses a mortal wounds table, or did at the time, and he ended up coming back from the brink with the ability to speak to spirits. And the spirit of the tomb, he spoke with it, and he negotiated with the spirit to let them escape. So they said they were going to go north. They went south. Hobbs improvised entirely an adventure location. They almost died, almost TPK'd, but at the end of the day, they had a bead on a new adventure site. They had a weird power in a crippled character. They had one of the most memorable recordings in the series, and they had another adventure site. They had a place on the map that they could go next time. They could say, okay, we want to go back to Undead Crab Spirit Island, and it's a place on a map. This is a testament to the low prep GM or the high prep GM. If you know the game well enough, if you're running the sandbox, just use tables. You don't even need to know what the location, you don't even need to know what the hex type is. You can roll that. You can randomize everything as you go. Might it be a little slower than prepping? Yeah, but you can do it. The game doesn't have to stop if the player doesn't go the direction you expect. There are tools in the toolkit designed to accommodate that scenario. Similarly, if you're a higher prep GM, and I am a high prep GM, I'll have to do another episode on high prep versus low prep and how I'm a high prep, but I don't judge. I have locations. What I like to do, and what a lot of people will do, is they'll create a map. They'll have 4 or 5 dungeons of varying sizes, and then they'll just set you free. If you go north like you said you would, cool. If you go south instead, you just encounter what's in the other direction. One of the strengths of the sandbox, in this sense, having a 10 by 10 grid and putting them on 5x5, is they don't have to go in a direction. The narrative is entirely at the behest of the player. So when they do something weird, that might actually be more fun than if they go the direction you thought they would. So what I think that means, I'm 0 for 3. It's not always adversarial to turn the other way from where you signaled. Okay, I can't figure out how to be consistently adversarial to my ref. So, how can I be adversarial towards my fellow players? We'll start with the elephant in the room, or in the tower, as Appendix N may lead us to. PvP. What happens if I attack my fellow players? Ages ago, Carl of the GMologist Presents shared a story about a Pendragon campaign which culminated in several knights who turned on one of their fellow players. It was one of their knights' brothers, and they took him out and divvied up his land and messed up and upended the direction the campaign was going through a dramatic act of betrayal. Now, that is very Shakespearean, very thematic, but it damaged a friendship. The player disappeared, and I don't actually remember if that player came back. If you are playing a game with high investment, a complicated game where you've spent 2 hours building the character, or even an OSR game where you may have just played that character for a few months and you feel like you throw it down the drain when they die, being betrayed can suck. Further, if we're in the dungeon and you stab my character in the back, that's a liability. I need to be able to trust my fellows in the dungeon. If you kill your retainers on the way out so that you don't have to pay them, you're not going to have retainers after a few sessions. Similarly, if you stab other player characters, after a while, I'm going to be looking the other way if that player metagames and knows that you can't be trusted. So, ending friendships, endangering the party, and actively shortening the campaign by cutting off valuable resources. Surely, this is adversarial play. But what about the domain level? One of the hallmarks of TSR editions of the game is that you are intended to build a fortress. You are a baron. You are a tower-holding wizard. You are a patriarch of your church. You are somebody who matters, and there are people who are under you, and you have to defend your territory. Does this mean that the referee is going to be putting huge threat, kaiju coming down, celestial things, Thanos, every other session? No. The intrigue comes from players. The original LBBs were released as a supplement to Chainmail so that you could tack them on to your wargaming experience. You could go as a Delver, but you were supposed to build your army up, build your forces up, so that you could deal with the outside world. You could deal with existential threats. You could compete with each other for scarce resources. You made your way out of the dungeon and onto the sand table. While there's nothing stopping you from throwing existential threats at your players, if you're running a large table, as the book states, 50 players or so per referee, they're not all going to be at the table at the same time. What this implies is that they're going to be competing against each other. They will be playing different days, different adventures, different characters, and their higher level characters are going to be defending their domains. And so look at some of the Bronstein-inspired games that have been put on YouTube lately. Look at some of those play reports where you have multiple players communicating with each other behind the scenes, competing with each other, putting resources out, expending spells and manpower to undermine each other, to get into positions of power and to come out on top. My favorite recap, I will link it in the show notes, is Mr. Wargaming talking about his experience in Brovenloft. One, it was hilarious to listen to, but two, it's great. It's a great story. It's a classic example of multiple players working against each other on the map, and without doubt, the referee for that game had a lot to do coordinating, but the intrigue for the game, the excitement for the game came out of players. The referee didn't plan a thing apart from the map. The players saw what they had, picked their base, and ran with it. So, PvP at the right table, not only is it not adversarial, but it's the life of the party. Okay, so classical PvP at the table is not necessarily adversarial. Let's go away from the table and into the chair. How about players who are overbearing or who hog the spotlight? Ooh, a frog. Picture a frog in show notes. I finished my drive and I'm now walking outside. It's sort of raining, sort of not really, but I've got an umbrella and I'm trying to block the wind with it, so we'll see how that works. Where was I? What happens when one of your players is an aspiring thespian, an ultimate role player, who, getting into character, will bargain with the shopkeep while the other players are wanting to get into the dungeon, who, when encountering social circumstances, is always the face of the party, and who at the campfire will attempt to RP with the other player characters to get to know them a little better. In and of itself, that's mostly a playstyle difference, but at the same time, when you have someone like that who is always the face of the party, who always talks first, who has that force of character, it's entirely possible that other people at the table will not be heard. This has happened to me a handful of times. Now, I know it's hard to believe, but in person, I'm a lot less outgoing than I am on the radio. But it's a lot easier to talk to 200 or 300 people when I can't see you. But in those games, one of which I'm thinking about in person, we had a home campaign that we played at the comic shop after hours, and then one online where we were doing BX on Roll20. On 2 occasions, same thing happened. One of the other players had a very strong position on how we should go, what we should go, and I felt like I got kind of overruled. That is, maybe filibustered. Filibustered is the right word, because I can argue for a certain amount of time, but at some point I just want to get on with the game. I don't care if it's not my plan. I just don't want to talk anymore. I want to play. But the thing is, the same thing happened in both of those occasions. I just talked to the team. Talked to at the end of the session, I just brought up, I felt, was being over-talked, and in both occasions, the problem player said, sorry, they didn't mean to over-talk me, it's just how they were accustomed to playing the game, and we amended our strategy going forward to try to be more accommodating to shy old me. I appreciated that. I felt a little silly. Shouldn't I be able to advocate for myself? But I appreciated it. Contrast that to the girlfriend effect, namely a game that I really enjoyed, the first campaign that I played in with one of my roommates who would go on to be my most involved player. We were back and forth in every campaign each other ran for like 4 or 5 years there. One of the other players who had been there a long time brought his wife. She did not say a word. She did not say a word for session after session after session. And I remember him talking about it at Waffle House. We're like, I keep throwing stuff at her. I keep trying to get her more involved, but she keeps coming back. So I guess she's happy. She was not really a talker. Now, if you could get her onto certain topics, like you could talk about the dog or babies and she'd start talking, but in the game, she was happy to watch. She was happy to participate in the combats, to roll dice, get excited about the successes, get nervous about our dangers, but she was happy for other people to do the RP. Similarly, I'm a fan of games with a caller, especially with groups I haven't really been playing with that much. Why? Because I need to feel people out. Like I said, I am a little shy around new people, and I have to figure out what kind of a game you like, what kind of a tone you go for, and how far I can go with my sense of humor before I can really commit to talking. So the caller is a great tool that speeds up play. It kind of breaks ties and moves the game forward unless there's a real need for discussion. And that allows me to feel out the group. I show up, I perform my role, same as my buddy's wife, and I figure out how I want to be. I come into my own. So sometimes being that overbearing player, talking when the other player isn't talking, isn't because you're obsessed with yourself. It isn't because you love that spotlight so much. Sometimes shy players need that separation. They need that participation to kind of get comfortable. At the same time, sometimes they're comfortable already. Sometimes they never come out of the shell, or once they do, remember, I can't think of a single animal with shells that has a mouth that likes to talk. So, not saying that I game with turtles and snails, but sometimes you're gaming with turtles and snails. I am officially 0 for 2 on being adversarial towards my fellow players. I could go on, but it is starting to rain on me a little bit, and the second I get into my house, then my wife is going to start talking, my kids are going to start pulling on my legs, and I'm not going to be able to finish. So I'm going to get to the point. Oh, my lights are off. Why are my lights off? So we've gone through a couple situations, a couple behaviors that in some situations can be adversarial and in others are not, or are even in some cases a service. But what does that mean? Well, it boils down to essentially a similar conclusion to adversarial ref. It's the spirit of the action. If you are rules lawyering to get an unfair advantage and wreck the experience for everybody else, that's adversarial play. If you are rules reading so that we learn how to play the game, we do it correctly, and we have new experiences, iron sharpening iron, not adversarial. If you are attacking other players and it messes up the party dynamic, it messes up the relationship, that's adversarial. If you're attacking other players in a context where attacking other players makes sense, more power to you. It's all part of the table. So, the moral of the story, the 2 coppers at the end of this tirade, no single behavior is going to be adversarial play. No single activity is going to be necessarily always bad. Some may be more bad than others in terms of proportion. Some may be more bad than others in terms of severity. But at the end of the day, an adversarial player is a player who prioritizes their own experience at the expense of everybody else.
Editor Taylor chiming in. In conclusion, it seems like you may be able to stab your friends in a context-appropriate manner, culminating a long campaign. You may be able to talk over your friends, waiting for them to come to terms with how the group works together and come into their own at the table. And you may even be able to get your referee to throw his books in the air, drop his dice off the table, and go home. In any case, whether or not you won D&D depends on how it gets told at the Waffle House after. I do have some call-ins, and I do have some feedback for my health, but I will have to get to those next episode as we're running up on that 30-minute mark where I'm trying to keep them these days. So I want to say thank you to those who did call in. Look forward to that coming up. And I want to say especially thank you after the Gray Skies, the comment. A whole bunch of you guys reached out to me, and I wanted to say that kind of disproved my initial concern that airing problems is a good way to lose friends. So with that in mind, thank you for reaching out to me, everyone who did, and thank you for the support, both in listening to the podcast and for touching base. We'll have some more updates next week, but don't you worry, I do promise to continue the focus on resolution, not dwelling on the problem. Until next time, delve on. And that wraps up this episode of the Whispering GM podcast, an independently operated product released for educational and informative purposes under the Totally Steal This license. Some sound effects are retrieved from Mixkit.co and used under the Mixkit.co royalty-free music license. Others are retrieved from Pixabay, made available under the Creative Commons 0. Theme music is Raw Power, licensed through PlayOnLoop.com. Parties interested in or with questions regarding the podcast are encouraged to reach out via the methods provided on the Clearing Square Ring Mail blog. Thank you for listening, and delve on.